From Washington to Moscow, from New York to Paris, from Rome to Jerusalem, around the world, the prophecies of the Bible are being fulfilled. J.R. Church, author and lecturer, is standing by with today's analysis of Bible prophecy. History has reached an impasse. The world is soon to see the return of Jesus Christ. And now, here is J.R. Church with today's Prophecy in the News.
On March 28, 1979, an incident occurred at a nuclear power plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And in the many days that followed, the American public was reminded again and again and again of the impending doom that hung over our heads. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. On April 1st, the Sunday edition of the Washington Star carried a 6-column headline entitled, "Evacuation of Nuclear Plant Area Likely." The newspaper noted that close to 250,000 people might be moved, with the decision to order a large-scale evacuation almost inevitable. Few people seemed to notice that the scare article appeared on April Fool's Day. So let's find out just what did happen, or perhaps we should say what did not happen. First of all, not a single person was killed or seriously injured or hospitalized because of a failure of a nuclear plant to operate correctly. Not only was the public insulated from harm, but none of those who actually worked to repair the plant were hurt. Second, there was no meltdown. Newsweek magazine reported that a meltdown would be catastrophic. They considered it the greatest risk of all. In theory, said Newsweek, the core could melt its way through the thick steel walls of the reactor vessel, penetrate the floor of the containment structure, contaminate the soil, or hit a water pocket and send up gushers of radioactive steam and contaminants. And, they said, if that happened, there might be thousands of deaths later on. The meltdown, of course, did not occur. But even if it had, it is quite possible that if it had occurred, it would not have resulted in a catastrophe. The idea of a meltdown was the theme of a movie starring Jane Fonda entitled The China Syndrome, which just happened to hit the market before the incident at 3 Mile Island. In the movie, the radical Jane Fonda portrayed the part of a television reporter who just happened to be at a nuclear plant with her cameraman when an accident takes place. The term China Syndrome is a jargon for meltdown that sinks through steel, concrete, and earth all the way to China. Or it hits groundwater and sends up radioactive steam up into the atmosphere, which can kill people by fallout, according to the movie. The film is nothing more than a propaganda on the part of lovers of communism who are trying to scare the American public into opposing the use of nuclear materials, and thus render our nation powerless in the face of possible communist aggression. Without nuclear power to make up for our shortage of other fuels, our country would be unable to defend itself from the threats of the Soviet Union. And that threat could include a nuclear holocaust of over 100 million Americans. United States Representative John B. Anderson from Illinois, former ranking Republican on the House Energy Committee, said, "It was a great hoax, a gross overreaction." Nuclear expert L. Manning Munsing, former director of regulation for the United States Atomic Energy Commission, declared flatly it was a phony crisis. And Dr. James Rusk, professor of nuclear engineering at Georgia Tech, made the statement, it was a hoax, pure and simple, and the American people were the victims. In our research, we have found 4 things from top nuclear scientists. Number 1, the highly publicized possibility of a meltdown in which radioactive material burns through the floor of a nuclear plant and escapes was an utter impossibility. Second, there was absolutely no chance that the notorious hydrogen bubble that developed inside the reactor could explode. And even if it did, it could not puncture the 3.5-foot thick cement and steel walls of the power plant. Then third, by April 1st, just 4 days after the nuclear plant breakdown, the federal government had a sophisticated computerized analysis showing that an explosion or meltdown was impossible, but they failed to release this report to the public. Then fourth, inside the nuclear power plant, the technicians were calm and cool, as backup systems designed to handle such an emergency functioned properly, and the situation was brought under control. In fact, say knowledgeable experts, the events proved, not disproved, the safety of nuclear energy. But the truth did not stop fearmongers from spewing vicious falsehoods. Dr. James Rusk, professor of nuclear engineering at Georgia Tech, said that the American public was led to the edge of panic and for no reason. Powerful groups of anti-nuclear campaigners seized this golden opportunity for propaganda. They played on the fears of every American and caused everyone to be hoaxed. Nuclear chemists, Arthur R. Matheson, a private nuclear consultant and former official of the General Atomic Company, was quoted as saying, "Everybody concerned, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the media, the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is an anti-nuclear group, held America at ransom and held us at the edge of panic for days after the danger was really past." Whenever the utility company, which owned the plant, released a statement, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission would follow with its own statement, warning of even greater dangers. And Representative John B. Anderson said what they did was irresponsible. He said he was outraged at the way the situation was handled. And to make matters worse, the media pointed out that the nation had several nuclear plants that were almost identical to the one that had broken down. So every time the Nuclear Regulatory Commission made a pronouncement, it sent shudders up and down the spines of Americans everywhere. Ironically, the 3 Mile Island incident proved that nuclear energy is safe. For though the managers of the Harrisburg plant seemed to do everything wrong, right down to shutting off the fail-safe controls at least 2 weeks before the accident, thereby bringing it on, no one was hurt. The nuclear energy industry can still say that there has not been a single fatality in the years it has been operating, either among the public or the personnel who runs the plants. Compare this to the 4,000 people annually who succumb to black lung disease in the coal mines, and hundreds killed or badly injured in transporting fuel, not to mention the dangerous pollution created by burning coal. What upsets me is the passion with which the press seized on the story and blew it up into catastrophic news. Recently, a Boeing 727 airliner went mysteriously out of control, plummeting many thousands of feet before it pulled out of its barrel roll. But no responsible newspaper is demanding that all planes be grounded, and no one in the media is arguing that the aircraft should be, or that all aircraft must be prevented from flying until every plane is 100% free of risk. Yet the news media insulted officials who were patiently trying to explain that there was no need for hysteria over the 3 Mile Island incident. But what about radiation? Was there a potential danger to the inhabitants of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania? According to data released by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the largest dose anyone residing in the area of the plant was likely to have received during the first 5 days following the accident was a total dose of 80 millirems. And that dosage would be received only if an individual continually stayed outside 24 hours a day at the hottest recorded spot. Now, the average skin exposure from a common chest X-ray is 40 millirems. In other words, the most radiation experienced at the site would have been that of 2 chest X-rays. The average annual dose each of us gets from natural background radiation is 130 millirems. Medical and dental use of radiation annually at an average of almost 70 millirems, for an average total exposure for each person in the United States from all sources of radiation of approximately 200 millirems per year. The maximum for radiation workers is 5,000 millirems per year. These conservative levels, in comparison with doses at which people become noticeably ill, these are just incidental. At a dose of 100,000 millirems, some people experience nausea and fatigue. At 250,000 millirems, there would be a few fatalities. So you see, the exposures experienced by the 25,000 people living within the 5-mile radius of the 3-mile island didn't even come close to anything considered dangerous. And no one denies that the incident at 3 Mile Island was serious, or that something more serious couldn't have occurred. And nuclear energy proponents are eager to find out what went wrong and correct it. But the nuclear industry, which supplies 13% of our energy in the United States, still has an enviable safety record. According to the Atomic Industrial Forum, no radiation-related death can yet be attributed to a single one of the 72 commercial atomic power plants in the United States, nor can any be traced to the nuclear plants in the rest of the Western world. Yet, more than 250,000 fatalities have been caused by motor vehicles in the United States during the 18 years in which nuclear plants have inflicted no serious injuries. There was an incident back in 1961 which took the lives of 3 workers in a reactor plant in Idaho. However, the tragedy was labeled as a murder-suicide. One of the workers deliberately pulled a control rod out of the reactor core and set off a horrible explosion that killed him and 2 other workers. According to Dr. Stephen Hanauer, an assistant director of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, there was a love triangle consisting of 2 of the operators and the wife of one of the men. Other than that deliberate murder-suicide, there have been no accidents at nuclear plants endangering the lives of others. This cannot be said of any other industry involved in energy. I want to introduce now Lieutenant Commander Bill Neal, United States Naval Reserve, retired. During his years of service in our country, he was trained in nuclear physics and in atomic defense. I asked Commander Neal, why all this controversy over nuclear energy?
The present controversy over nuclear energy is part and parcel of the worldwide communist conspiracy. J. Edgar Hoover called them masters of deceit. They will use every means possible to render America powerless in the face of their ever-growing strength. If you recall, during the Vietnam War, prominent Americans were trying to convince the American public that we should simply pull our troops out of South Vietnam and let the communists have it. In fact, that is what they accomplished. They were people like Jane Fonda, the actress, Dr. Benjamin Spock, Tom Hayden, speaking out against America's involvement in the Vietnam War. They were very skillful. In fact, they succeeded, and the United States pulled its troops out of Southeast Asia, turning the country over to the communists. Since then, we have seen the terrible atrocities that were committed against the poor people in South Vietnam. Literally hundreds of thousands of people suffered and bled at the hands of the brutal, bloody communists. Today we see these same people, Jane Fonda, Dr. Benjamin Spock, Tom Hayden, trying to convince the American public not to develop nuclear energy. But if we listen to their siren song and do not develop this tremendous source of power, while the communist world continues to develop it, we will be giving the communists a tremendous advantage in power in the nuclear field.
One of the problems involved in nuclear energy is the disposal of radioactive waste materials. When the nuclear fuel rods inside the core of a nuclear power plant reach a certain level of use, they are pulled, stored in containers, and buried. Of course, the waste problem cannot all be blamed on nuclear power. The problem began more than 30 years ago when the United States started making plutonium for nuclear bombs. and putting nuclear reactors in submarines. The defense waste is enormous. Some 500,000 pounds of highly radioactive material has been produced. It is stashed temporarily in tanks and burial pits, mostly on 3 government reservations in Washington, South Carolina, and Idaho, awaiting government action on permanent disposal. To this huge accumulation, nuclear plants have added something less than 5,000 tons of spent fuel. Yet the fear of radioactivity has focused largely on power plants. The United States Atomic Energy Commission from 1946 to 1970 dumped tens of thousands of canisters of low-level nuclear trash into the Atlantic Ocean, 120 miles east of the Maryland-Delaware coast, and into the Pacific, 35 miles west of San Francisco. What should be done with nuclear waste? Or rather, what could be done with the nuclear fuel rods after they have been used in a nuclear power plant? Commander Neal.
The nuclear fuel rods presently used are discarded only after 10% of its potential has been consumed. Government bureaucratic regulations prevent the reprocessing of the fuel, and we wouldn't have the pressing storage problems if the government would allow the fuel to be reprocessed. Reprocessing would give us 10 times more fuel consumption than is presently available. When the fuel rod has become caked with corrosion, with a lot of byproducts, the efficiency of the fuel is decreased, and it needs to be reprocessed to use it to the fullest extent. However, the government stepped in with regulations and prevented the reprocessing, even though it's a very safe procedure. But the government bureaucratic control says no. Much of our problem concerning nuclear fuel and waste would be solved if those restrictions were lifted.
The National Geographic, in its April 1979 issue, gave a 36-page spread on the promise and peril of nuclear energy. Among the many related subjects discussed in the documentary was an article on the controversial fast breeder reactor. Construction of a fast breeder is presently banned in the United States, though the other countries in the world have already begun to build them. This fantastic nuclear reactor offers greater promise in the field of energy than anything ever developed in history. It actually produces more fuel than it consumes. I asked Commander Neal to explain the advantages of the fast breeder reactor.
The fast breeder is a special kind of reactor that produces more fuel than it consumes. To understand this, you need to know something about uranium. The ore consists of one part of uranium-235, which is fissionable, and thus can be used as fuel, and it contains 140 parts of uranium-238, which is not fissionable. The huge amount of uranium-238 remains as waste, but if the waste is placed around the core of a breeder reactor, it will be bombarded by neutrons from the fissionable uranium-235, and that will transmute the uranium-238 into plutonium-239, which is a fissionable material, and which can be used in reactors for fuel. Thus, with breeders, it is theoretically possible to extract 60 times as much energy or more from uranium as with conventional reactors, since the uranium-238 in the spent fuel can be used over and over again through enrichment processes. Also, the fast breeder reactor will enable us to use what was non-fissionable thorium, which is 4.33 times more plentiful than both uranium-235 and 238 combined. So the fast breeder will multiply our fissionable material 60 times in uranium and 4.33 times that by converting thorium into a fissionable material. If, of course, the American people will not allow the radicals to dupe us into opposing nuclear energy. We must write our congressmen, our senators, our president, and urge them to continue the development of nuclear energy and, of course, develop and accelerate the breeder reactor. This will help us become independent of foreign oil. In fact, with the fast breeder reactor, we can literally burn rocks and turn them into energy. Now, this may sound unbelievable, but it is really true. With the fast breeder reactor, 1 ton of rock can produce as much energy as the equivalent of 40 tons of coal. A process presently available can extract thorium and uranium from rock. Thorium and uranium are evenly distributed throughout the Earth's rocks and throughout the Earth's crust. The first 10 feet of the rocks in the Earth's surface contain enough thorium and uranium to provide our world with energy for the next 1.5 million years.
Why did the incident at 3 Mile Island just happen to occur about the same time the movie China Syndrome was released in movie houses across our nation? And why did it occur immediately after the publication of the April 1979 issue of National Geographic magazine, which carried a 36-page spread on the subject, The Promise and Peril of Nuclear Energy, complete with full-color pictures? Was the incident at 3 Mile Island an accident? Representative Robert K. Dornan, Republican of California, has made the statement that all of the information to date clearly points in the direction of an act of sabotage. He said the safety features built into the nuclear plants make it unlikely that a chain of events that occurred did so without human design. Pennsylvania State Representative Joseph Zeller, who worked for 15 years with a firm which constructed nuclear plants, said this was sabotage. He said somebody or some team deliberately crippled that plant. This couldn't happen without tampering. This was sabotage. Mr. John Gilbertson, a veteran nuclear engineer, also said too many things have happened here for this not to be sabotage. Somebody shut off the injection system. Another leading nuclear expert said, that's mind-boggling. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is asking us to believe that for 14 days, 24 hours a day, a staff of at least 30 highly trained engineers and technicians in that control room walked past a critical switch with a tag on it that said, turn this on, and nobody turned it on. As far as I'm concerned, it's impossible, he said. Those valves are one of the most critical pieces of equipment to the safety of that nuclear plant. They're never supposed to be turned off while the reactor is operating, because when they're off, any simple turbine shutdown for any reason at all can cause a nuclear accident. Every man in that control room knew that. They all know the system perfectly. He said, I can only conclude that if somebody turned them off, it was deliberate, an act of sabotage. The Russian invasion of Ezekiel 38 is in the making. America's great military power is being neutralized. The American public is being brainwashed to give up before the battle begins. Until next time, keep looking up.